Hey, Katya, welcome to the Value Driven Marketing Podcast. So nice to have you today.
Hi, Lena. Thank you so much for having me.
How are you doing? How are things?
I'm good. Thank you. Enjoying the summertime. It's quite hot today.
It is. Katya, I'm super excited to be discussing everything about growth marketing, what it means, what it takes to run successful experiments. But before we jump in, there's a question that I like to ask my guests, and that is, what was your dream job as a child?
Oh, wow. I need to think about it. I'm sure I went through different phases. And maybe I think I wanted to become a doctor and a teacher. But I think one of the most fun ones is that I wanted to be a journalist at one point.
Oh.
So I had this super old recorder, back in the 90s when I was a child. And then I would run around and record some interviews. And then I would also transcribe them and create some handmade magazine. So I kind of felt like I was a designer, a producer, a publisher. And of course, the technology changed dramatically, but I think my passion for content production and storytelling stayed.
Oh, that's very nice. So you carried on with what you're doing now. So this is really nice. Cool. Thanks for sharing with us. So let's maybe start from the ground zero, because I feel that there's a lot of misconception around what growth marketing truly is. So can we start from here? What is growth marketing and what growth marketing is not?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are so many different terms that create some confusion. And of course, we have growth marketing, growth hacking, but it adds demand generation, performance marketing, digital marketing to the list. And all of these terms are misused and misinterpreted from time to time. So I think if we talk about growth hacking, the term was invented by Sean Ellis in 2010. It was more about how to approach scaling a startup and the mindset behind that process. And then, as far as I know, the term growth came from the product side. So that's a little bit different story. And recently, we started to see the shift from growth hacking to growth marketing, because I think overall the community felt that the growth hacker is a little bit of a negative term, that it's all about the hacks and it's not ethical or sustainable. So I think now we see growth marketing as a more widespread terminology. And if we try to simplify it, it is about a data-driven approach of rapid experimentation. It's about running experiments really fast, getting some results, then optimize the product, or it could be also a marketing channel, and then repeat it, and then go through that circle again and again. And also what is a little bit different in growth marketing compared to traditional marketing is that you focus on a full funnel instead of, let's say, focusing on just awareness. And some marketing teams can approach awareness more than the whole funnel.
Oh, that's a very good overview, and the rapid iteration would sound as if it's more suitable to certain types of companies. So can you maybe let us know, do you think there's a specific type of company or specific companies that can benefit from running growth marketing experiments? What do you think?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I think everyone could benefit from it if you think about growth marketing as a change in mindset, because also the word growth is the key there. And there's a concept by Carol Dweck about growth mindset. She published a book quite some time ago, and it is about overcoming the fear of failures. And I think if your company is ready to experiment and fail and accept that, the experiment was a failure, then sure, go for it, because then you need to have some resources to run this experiment, and not every company can afford that. So I think that's the main difference, and not really the difference in the size between the companies or a focus, because I think equally a startup can benefit from it and the corporation. It's more about, what is the system that you would like to activate, because that's more like, growth marketing. It's more a framework, and I think there are some alternative frameworks that you could use, when you set up your marketing and product team.
And do you think there's a certain development stage in a company's life when it's best to get started with growth marketing?
Yes, I would say it's really important that your company has a certain level of data maturity. Because without access to data, you can't really run experiments, you can't make data-driven decisions. So I actually mentored some marketers that didn't have access to, let's say, Google Analytics. And then, of course, you can't run experiments on your website if you don't have that access, or if everything goes through your IT team. So it's really important that you have this primary access to data. And then, especially if you work across the departments, it also has to flow really well, right? Because sometimes we know that, let's say, the product team has one kind of data, the sales team has something else, and then the marketing team has something else, and it's not really connected. So I think the data is the key there. And also overall, it's again the mindset, the growth mindset, and also some sort of psychological safety that you have in the company, because it is a little bit about taking that risk, and it's really important that it's acceptable in your team, that you try something new, you fail, and then you try again, because also we know that some environments are a little bit too stiff and restricted, and I think in this environment it will be really hard to build the growth marketing system.
So the culture of trying and knowing that it might fail, but seeing failure as a learning opportunity, so having those those elements in place, I would say that's important. And because you mentioned data maturity, how far back should you look? So you mentioned you work with teams that didn't have access to Google Analytics. So how much of a history would you recommend having to get started?
Overall, of course, it's always beneficial to have some year-over-year data. And it's amazing if you have a data analyst or data scientist in your team that could help you to track back like what happened in the past. But I also noticed in some organizations that have this data maturity, you can also get lost a little bit in year-over-year analytics, because some companies that experience the hyper growth, and I worked for one of those, you grow 200% a year, and it doesn't matter what you do, you will still see the progress year over year. So you also need to find creative ways to measure your impact, because sometimes it could be just the growth of the industry or the growth of the company itself, and it's not really about the marketing activities that you're running. So in that sense, I think you just work with whatever you have and just make sure that your data is not misleading, because the lack of data is something that you can find the workaround. But I think if your data is inaccurate or misleading, you can make a decision about the future that would be damaging for the business or for your project.
So have access to ideally at least 1 year, but make sure it's the right kind of data and analytics is set up right.
Yeah, exactly. Because I also met some companies that, let's say, worked with external consultants, and something was said incorrectly and nobody noticed. And then several years later, you have a huge problem. So ideally, that you try to avoid it and make sure you have the accurate data points.
And you mentioned the fear of failure. I'm wondering if we can isolate what are the foundational steps that you need to have when you start experimenting.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. So you need to start with overall, psychological safety in the team. And it's something that I see a lot in different leadership discussions, that a lot of leaders sit together and they're like, so how do we create this psychological safety in our team? So it's much more difficult than, let's say, make sure that you have access to data, Maybe with a data project, you can set things up within 3 or 6 months. But with psychological safety, if you have a shitty culture in your company, it's something that you wouldn't be able to fix overnight. So the steps there, I think overall, running some anonymous surveys really help to understand what is the current state of things in your company. And I know that a lot of companies do that, especially corporates. And also I see it more in startups and scale-ups. And then you could validate some of your assumptions, but you need to make sure that, let's say, there's no point of running a survey if your team is 5 people and then everyone will know, who gave those answers. So you need to provide people with that sense of security and make it as anonymous as it could be. And when you got all the results, you can look at maybe some of the processes and rituals that you could change. Like, for example, in the environments where I worked in the past, it would be very common to have some shiny presentations that you share with everyone. And, you would have some quarterly reviews or some monthly reviews. And then the point of these reviews would be just to share how much of awesome work you've done and how amazing your campaigns are. But I think then you miss a point as a team, because then people don't share what went wrong. And there are certain ways and certain templates you could use to encourage people to highlight what you could have done differently. And it doesn't have to be a failure board or something per se, because people hate that word. And I think people close up as soon as they hear the word failure. But you could talk about some improvements they could have done in their projects. And just to make sure that it's not, a one conversation that you run, but it's actually integrated in your existing process. Like if you have this marketing presentations, then make sure that at the end of it, there is some sort of template slide that people use, and then they could add those points. And in the beginning, maybe people will talk about failures, but then, it's almost like at the job interview when you ask, what is your, what is your fall? And then the person says, I'm so hardworking.
And so perfectionist.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a perfectionist. So you need to avoid that as well, because people will try to hide. And I think it's a natural tendency, and we see that a lot on LinkedIn, right? That people love bragging about their accomplishments, but it's we see the opportunities to share the people's failures more often now. So I think you need to do the same in your organization to make it okay to talk about those things.
And highlight the learnings and what can be done differently, because I guess that's the silver line.
And I think another common mistake that I've seen is that you don't keep track of past experiments. So you don't have a library in your company or any database. So there are some enthusiasts that run some experiments, or they would like to kind of track all the outcomes, but there's no place for that. So people do it on their own, and then it never becomes a system. So it's really important that you create, again, like you look into your processes and you create some sort of document that people could fill in and everyone knows about it.
Okay, that's very interesting. And can we talk how I wouldn't use the word typical, but how would a growth marketing experiment look like?
Yeah, great question. I think overall the growth experiments are not different to any scientific experiments. So, remember at school when, let's say, like you learned that Galileo demonstrated that objects fall at the same speed because of gravity. So it's something similar. So sometimes people get scared when they hear the word experiment, because maybe they have bad memories about chemistry at school or something, but it's actually not as difficult. It is a very scientific approach. So you start with the hypothesis. For example, if we take it to marketing space, it could be something by reducing the number of steps to book a demo at a SaaS scale-up, you will increase the number of booked calls, something like this. It has to be really simple and easy to validate within a short period of time. So what I've seen is that people, especially when they start formulating hypotheses for the first time in their life, they take big projects and they say, when we launch the product X in our portfolio, it will solve a pain point of our customer or something like this. And then they don't break it down. So it's really important that you break it down and make sure that it's something that you could implement within 2 or 3 weeks maximum, because that's the standard experimentation timeline that most companies recommend. And then you need to make sure that also what is the success for this experiment, because sometimes when you don't set the measurements, let's say you even don't identify the metric that you measure, let's say it will be signups or something like this, you don't say what is the, let's say, growth of signups that you expect within this 2 or 3 weeks, and you don't know if this experiment is a success or if it is a failure. So it's really important to be super precise. Let's say I expect 20% more signups if I do some changes to that landing page or something like this. And then, of course, it's important to remember your blockers, because I know that we collaborate with other departments normally, and sometimes you need your IT department to implement something. Sometimes you need your legal department to approve something. So those things you need to take into account, because that might take much longer than just 1 or 2 days. So you need to take it out of your experiment canvas, basically, and do it first, and then maybe set a little bit different timeline for the actual experimentation.
So, prepare your ground, let's say, and then let the experiment, after you're done with everything, let it run for 2 to 3 weeks, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes you might need even more research, or, the beauty of it, when you start experimenting, you will constantly get new updates. So you will need to set up new experiments. And that's really rewarding, actually, even if it was a failure, and even if you didn't validate your original assumption, you still learn something new. And then it helps you to find this hyper growth areas.
And I'm curious, Katya, you mentioned hypotheses and how you formulate them. Is there are there some best practices or things you need to look at in order to formulate, I wouldn't say right, but rather realistic or very grounded hypotheses or assumptions?
Great question, because there are a lot of examples out there. Like, even if you type in, let's say, I don't know, something like good hypothesis for growth marketing experiment, you will see some examples. So I suggest you even use some sort of template that could be, by doing X, I expect X, something like this to start with. And then, of course, when you get into it, you can play with the different ways of making that statement. But also, there are a lot of libraries where you could actually check what other companies are doing. So sometimes you could even select the industry, let's say you, or more like a focus area of the company. Let's say you work in e-commerce, so you could see what other e-commerce players are doing, or let's say a SaaS B2B scale up, and then you could see what they're doing, and then you could just get that inspiration. And maybe if you feel really stuck, you could make sure that you take their ideas and try them on first, and then I think as soon as you go forward, you will have more ideas on your own.
So maybe start with some inspiration from others, and then build your own assumptions as you move forward.
Exactly. Yeah.
And looking at metrics, what do you recommend that marketing teams look at when it comes to their experiments? So what KPIs would you recommend?
Yeah. I would say I hope that nowadays marketing people know their own KPIs quite well, because I think being data-driven became quite a big part of that profession, unless you're a creative mind and you're more into let's say creative work. But even then, I think it's measured nowadays. But overall, I would say you just need to make sure you remember your core metric. In growth marketing, there is a term, one metric that matters. In product, there is a term, North Star metric, right? So it's something that gives you the direction. So let's say if you have 10 experiment ideas, you might prioritize them depending on the impact on your core metric. Because your experiments can be focusing on different metrics, and that's okay. But then it will help you to see that direction and focus on something that can have a huge impact on your business. So I think that's the only one to keep in mind for the metric. And of course, if you have the focus on different stages of the funnel, again, your metrics will be a little bit different, because then let's say you have the awareness stage, acquisition, activation, and then it might be something different. And that's also another good way to generate new ideas for your experiments, that you can map out all the stages of the funnel and see, the customer journey that you have in the company, and kind of brainstorm the experiment ideas that could help to improve that journey.
Okay, super interesting. And can we talk about channels as well? So how do you recommend selecting the channels on which to experiment? And is it a number of channels? Do you recommend narrowing down the focus?
Yeah, I think the best practice, and if you explore, growth marketing communities like Reforge and others, would be to make sure that you nail one channel before you move to another channel. Especially if you are a startup, it's quite complicated to be a market leader on a certain channel. Even if you decide to focus on just one social network, it will take you some time, to get to that leadership position. So it's really important that you explore one channel, then, focus on it, really scale your presence there, and then you consider other channels, unless you have so much budget that, and resources that you need to urgently kind of burn through that budget. That's a different story. But I think most of us, especially in the startup world, you're very focused where you want to be. So I think that's one recommendation about the channels. And of course, overall exploring a new channel, I think that's fascinating and very difficult. And there are some beautiful charts that show, let's say, the growth and the decline of some of the core channels that we're using. Like, for example, I don't know, like LinkedIn, Instagram, and some past channels like MySpace and so on. So it's really important to enter that space when there is still a potential of growth. So choose a channel that is scalable. And sometimes, we see that people join like at the end of that hype, and then it's really hard to build the authority. It's really hard to fight. It's very expensive, like what we see now with the paid ads, on Instagram, Facebook. It's just really, really competitive and expensive. So if you're a startup, you kind of need to look for these channels that still have potential to growth. Like, for example, a lot of B2B companies started to explore TikTok because it was not yet saturated space. It was easy to grow the following. And at one point it will become a mainstream, and then it will be much harder to explore.
And I guess maybe it's also important to look at what you do well or you can do easily, because I guess if you have video skills, for example, then maybe YouTube could be a channel, but if you don't, it might be kind of difficult to.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and we see that quite a lot. That also, let's say, people have a really great presence on TikTok, and let's say they're really good at video format, but then they decide to move, I don't know, to LinkedIn, where the word posts, they perform better, and you need to be a good writer, and maybe you don't have that skill in your team. So it's always about the skill set that you have available. And again, when you brainstorm the experiment ideas, it's really important to rank your ideas, and there are different frameworks to use to do that. You can easily look up on the internet and find the one that fits your business needs. But the point behind the ranking, that you prioritize your ideas, and one of them, it is about scalability of that idea. Like, what is the impact that it's going to have? And especially if you explore a new channel, you can really approach it as the experiment, right? You don't have to allocate huge amount of budget to make it a success, you can really do a quick test for 2-3 weeks to check if there is if it's a fit for you or not.
Okay, very good point. And speaking of resources, what do you think are the needed resources in order to run growth experiments, both in terms of skills, and maybe we can also touch on tools as well?
Yeah, I think maybe I would share my personal story. I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when I did my first growth marketing course, I brought that knowledge to the team. And very quickly, I realized that as kind of one person that is very enthusiastic, it's really hard to drive that change. So you really need to upskill people around you. And then I got a team subscription to all team members on Conversion Excel, so they could start learning about this. Then I started to run workshops to educate people. Then I started to make some suggestions around the processes and so on. For me personally, it is about building that skill set first, because if you have all the useful tools and even the most expensive ones, we see that if they're not integrated in the existing workflows, people are not using them. So it is, this impulse is coming from people. So I think originally, if you're switching from more traditional approach to growth marketing, it's really important that you talk to your team, you make sure that they understand that change, that they're not resistant to that change. And you do a little bit of, upskilling of your team. And then you can look into tools, and some of them are cheap and you can always try and drop them. But some of them are a little bit more of a commitment, right? So you need to be conscious of your decision. And then finally, processes and rituals are really important to make sure that it is, let's say, because for the experiments, you need some sort of sprint system. You need to make sure that there is some, sprint structure and how you're running them. And there is a project manager or someone who makes sure that, all the deliverables, they're happening. So for that, you need to think about how you could use your existing systems and processes and take them to a different level with growth marketing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it's not just skills, tools, but it's also processes and documentation. Documenting what.
Exactly. I think we all experience that when, let's say, marketing suddenly got very technical. Let's say 10, 15 years ago, it was a very different story. And then suddenly we started to get so many tools, and then it was possible to measure so many things that were not possible before. So I think it's really it's the same kind of change that is happening, because probably you remember that some team members were not on board with something, and then you need to win them over. So it's a lot about this showing the benefits to everyone, like how they're going to benefit from that new system, because it is a lot about change management and driving that change in your organization, because sometimes you need to influence also your sales team or product team or legal. So it's not only about marketing team that you need to focus on.
Okay, that's a very good point. And can we speak about mistakes as well? So what are some of the most common mistakes you've seen marketing teams make when they run experiments?
Yeah. Well, I would say, the fear of failure that we discussed, I think that's a big one. And that's a big obstacle to drive that change. And, they kind of, when people think that it's a soft skill and that's not important, that's a buzzword and why would we spend time on it? So I think that's the first one. And then secondly, I would say a little bit of the imposter syndrome or something, because I've seen, I've run this different coaching sessions, and maybe in the last year I had 100 plus with people from corporates, with people from startups, really different career paths. Some of them are a little bit more technical. Some of them are like global managers and maybe not as technical. But the common line was that a lot of people felt insecure that this tech movement in marketing that is happening, and the growth marketing, maybe they're really behind the curve, and it's too late to start, or things like that. And that was really common among leaders and people that execute on things. So I would say it's important to remember that everyone is in the same boat. Like a lot of quite advanced growth marketing teams that run growth marketing experiments, they're still not there. So if you would like to start, you just need to go for it and slowly build it up, and remember that you're not alone.
Yeah, that's a good thing to remember. You can always ask for help, and you can always improve as you go. So it doesn't have to. That's the whole point. It doesn't have to be perfect. And because you mentioned, Katya, about mentoring, I'm curious to know from your coaching and mentoring experience, what are your top learnings when it comes to adopting a growth mindset, and then also starting to consistently run growth experiments?
Yeah. Great question, and definitely coaching is the topic I'm super passionate about. So I felt that one of the key aspects of my role as a coach and a mentor was to bust some common myths around growth marketing, and to make sure that it's more accessible in different organizations. So one of the first ones was that a lot of people have an expectation that growth marketing is all about digital. And, it's about digital world, it's only digital activities. But actually, you can set a lot of experiments offline as well. And that for example, that was something that blew the mind of people from brick and mortar stores, that you could also run experiments there. Like, it doesn't have to be e-commerce, it doesn't have to be digital. So in some traditional industries, you can also have growth mindset and, approach growth marketing just from a different side of it. And your experiments might last longer. I think 2-3 weeks might be a little bit too challenging, but you can still set it up and build that system. And another one was that also, I think A/B tests are extremely popular, right? And that's something that people are talking about, and there are a lot of tools that can help you with A/B tests. So the thing is that the list of experiments and tests, it's enormous. And A/B test, it's just one of the tests that you could run. And especially if you're in B2B space. And that was a common excuse for me maybe 5-6 years ago, that I would be like, well, but we don't get that much traffic. We have low traffic. And I hear that a lot among B2B marketeers. So if that's the case, there are tons of other experiments that you could explore. You can run some sequential testing, for example, when let's say you have you test one idea for 2 weeks and then another idea for 2 weeks, and then you compare the results. It doesn't have to be run at the same time. So you can approach the experimentation as a way to de-risk as well. And not only from the perspective of validating your assumptions. Like, for example, we know that the marketing budget is allocated to certain ideas. So why not running an experiment to test if it will be worth spending 30,000 euros on something? And then you can validate it first, and then commit to some high amounts that you need to spend on the activity.
So first start with something like a pilot, like break it down, and then
running a pilot is a perfect way to approach it, and you don't even have to call it an experiment.
And I love the idea that you don't need a lot of traffic, because that for me is a misconception as well. Like, I need a lot of traffic, otherwise the experiment is not going to be relevant. But to your point, it doesn't have to be related to traffic necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. So just pick the experiment that fits your industry. And for that, as I said, if you're not sure, you can look up online, and there are a lot of good business cases.
That's super interesting. I'm just wondering, for someone that's just getting started with running growth marketing experiments, would you recommend specific, resources, go-to resources that they can check just to, make their start easier?
Yeah, of course. I would say There are some good players in the space that you could follow. For example, for me, following Growth Tribe, Growth Mentor, Reforge, Conversion Excel was a game changer. So these four, I would say, probably the leading ones that come to my mind. I know also there are some powerful newsletters by different leading growth marketers that you could follow. But overall, use LinkedIn to your benefit, because I think a lot of people are complaining that they see a lot of random stuff in their timeline, but you need to curate it, right? So if you feel like, oh, actually, I would like to upskill myself a little bit, and if you know that you're already spending some time on LinkedIn, let's say even 5-10 minutes a day, then make sure that your timeline is curated and you follow people that are influencers in that space. And I think for me, that part was super meaningful, because this is where I started to learn really, some fresh insights from people, and not something that was published a few months ago and got outdated, but something that people are discussing as we speak.
Well, very nice. Thank you so much, Katya. This has been super insightful for me, and I'm sure for the people listening as well. And they can follow you on LinkedIn if they want to stay up to date with your work. So thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your ideas.
Thank you so much, Elena, for having me. It was really fun to talk about growth marketing. And thanks so much.